Welcome. This is Engaging Process, a podcast video series where art education and art making meet. I am art education professor Dr. Cam McComb. My pronouns are she, her. In this series, I talk one-on-one with professional artists, and today, a designer, to gain insight into the thinking, planning, experimentation, and research that becomes part of the design process. In this episode, I am delighted to be speaking with designer Ryan Malloy. Ryan, welcome to Engaging Process.
Thanks for having me, Cam.
Oh, yeah, I'm super excited. Now, before we get started, do you mind, what pronouns do you use?
He, him.
Thank you. And, as we were preparing for this segment, I realized, it's a conversation where artists and art education meet. And then I asked you, are you an artist or a designer? How would you answer that question?
I would call myself a designer. My background, I was trained as an architect, undergraduate degree in architecture. Typically falls under the bigger rubric of designer. Went to design. My MFA is in design.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
And so for people who don't really think about the difference, right? So what's the difference between an artist and a designer? And are you offended if people call you an artist, or
No,
give us some insight.
I'm not offended. So I actually had taught a course a couple of years ago that probed this exact question, was like, what's the difference between design, art, and craft? And sometimes it's just like a designer is a designer because you call yourself a designer. And that's like the mode of thinking and mentality that you have. I think there's a whole history of designers from the standpoint of thinking of design as problem solving, whatever those problems might be. Very much in the field of architecture, there's really that kind of sense of problem solving, right? I mean, you're like given a plot of land and a program that you have to fit a building to. And so I definitely think like there's a lot of that. There's the aspect of utility, I think, in a lot of design work that isn't necessarily in a lot of artwork. If we're thinking of a utility from the like very traditional standpoint of,
You mean like making something functional?
yeah, I'm making an object that has a purpose beyond communication, or in some cases actually communication, if we're thinking about graphic design, communication design.
That's why people really liked Frank Lloyd Wright, right? Because he sort of bridged that gap between art and design,
Right.
really talking about the form and function.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think there's an Eames quote somewhere out there that says like the best design gravitates towards what art is or becomes art.
It's not just fixing a problem.
Yeah,
I mean, we might think of my electrician comes in and fixes the problem, but they're not necessarily designing an entirely new solution.
right.
So you're looking at, and that is the creative aspect then, I suppose, of design.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so at what age did you become interested in this kind of work? Or have you always been interested in design?
I think I stumbled upon it by accident.
Yeah. How so?
My dad didn't want me to go to art school. And
Right.
when I was in high school, I really just didn't know what I wanted to do. And my dad was like, well, you can't go to art school. And I was like, well, what's the next most interesting thing? And I was involved in things like set design and theater in high school and a couple other things, technical theater. I kind of thought about that route and just kind of saw architecture school as the, maybe the thing that would bridge it. I really didn't know much about architecture at all, either in high school. I mean,
buildings. We're going to design buildings.
Making buildings sounds cool. And went into architecture completely blind and, really kind of embraced it, fell in love with it.
Yeah. So how come I'm not talking to an architect?
That's a good question. I think some of it has to do with, I had bigger interests at the time. So I worked 3 years in an architectural office before going to grad school. And I think some of it was the politics of working in a office in general, getting ideas, the frustration of getting ideas through a client, then your boss, then your colleagues. And I think at some point I was just finding myself doing more graphic design work at times in the firm. I was always a big fan of the sort of experimental architecture that's often labeled paper architecture, where it's never going to be built. It's solely going to exist
making maquettes
as
and designs and proposals.
Yeah, as a theoretical experiment. And so I was always interested in sort of that aspect of architecture. And I already had my bachelor's is a professional degree, which allows me to get licensed without having to get a master's degree.
Okay.
So it was a 5-year B.Arch program. And then
Okay.
I'm able to get licensing with it. And I was at that point where it's like, do I go get an M.Arch? I don't really need an M.Arch because I'm already at the point. And so I found the program at UT Austin that was just a design program where it's like, we're going to just question what design is in whatever form or fashion. And at the time, I was interested in doing some new media work as well.
New media involving like
Yeah, technology,
and video, things like that.
interactive things, web-based work. And I was kind of curious, like, what is that intersection of graphic design, architecture, new media?
Yeah.
And the program at UT kind of allowed me to sort of explore that.
Yeah. And we'll get into that, but all that's really relevant to today since we've really become a digital world, right? So you're like, oh, made a good career choice there. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And so you talked a little bit about your parents, your dad in particular. You know, I'm always interested in people who work in creative professions and whether or not they had support from their family. So you said, well, okay, you got squashed. You're not going to major in art. But how did they feel about you pursuing then design?
Oh, they had no problem with me pursuing architecture. My dad had an engineering background. It's very bizarre because I say this, and my mom was a speech and debate teacher and theater teacher.
Oh,
in
that
education.
explains a lot about what I know about you. Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
She very much worked with creatives in a very different aspect. And I think my mom embraced that. My dad embraced it to a degree, but his engineering background wanted to make sure that at least like I was able to get a career.
Right. You have to support yourself
You know.
and any future family. As a first gen graduate from college, that was always an emphasis on me. Like, not only am I going to be the one in the family to graduate, but I also had, to pursue a career. And they always steered me away from art. But then when I found art education, they were like, oh, okay, you're going to be an educator, a teacher. That's a good profession. So they sort of backed off a bit from that. So interesting. And so, so we're going to talk today about a couple things. We're going to talk about some design work you did locally, and then we're going to talk about your interest in letterpress, which I think is going to be interesting to talk about. So let's start with talking about this local design, right? So we both work at Eastern Michigan University and in Ypsilanti. So Ypsilanti has a great, I love living in Ypsilanti. It has a great character, and they have started, I think it's been running 4 years now. They have an independent film festival. And so you have designed is it the logo, the font, the branding? How would you say they reached out to you? And
I would call it the brand identity.
Okay.
Basically, I mean, it's part of the big portion of it is the logo.
Right.
And so you have the main logo that just says the word IFY, and then also the tagline, Independent Film Festival, Ypsilanti. But it's also not just the logo, but how the logo gets applied, how it gets used.
Right.
What are the components of when we're making posters to advertise this festival? What does that become?
Okay.
And Donald Harrison, I had worked with Donald Harrison and even Martin Thorburn, the two founders of IFY, years and years ago when Donald was at the Ann Arbor Film Festival.
Okay.
Martin had actually done some animation for me of the design I did for one of the years of the festival. And so I knew Martin and Donald going pretty far back. And then Donald had been working with him on a film project that he was doing called Kami High. And that project was going pretty well. And Donald asked me and brought me in, talked with him and Martin.
So to work on the
IFY.
design.
Yeah.
Interesting. So they had already decided to call it IFY when they reached out to you. So
Correct.
You already had that to work with.
Yeah.
And so, here I have on the screen. So if you're listening, we're going to describe a few things. And if you have an opportunity to watch, this is a podcast video series. So if you want to see the video, you can see that at my website, www.drcamcreates.com. And you can actually watch our conversation, and you can see some of these images that we're going to be referencing in the conversation. So the image I have currently is the final iteration you came up with IFY, right? IFFY, which is an interesting. So this next slide I'm going to show has different iterations of IFY, right? And I can see that you're messing around You might call it design. I call it messing around, right? You're like experimenting, trying to figure out what in the world am I doing. So, and this is not you drawing on a piece of paper. So, we've got different words and whatnot, and it's work you've done in a computer. So, tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here and how this comes to be.
Yeah, so I think what we're looking at on screen right now is one of the many early versions and prototypes as I was running through ideas. And so when I met with Donald and Martin to begin with, it was like there was a series of questions I just prompted them to begin with, like, what kind of identity are you looking for? Do we want an image-based? Are we looking for something like as a logo? Do we want to like stray away from those sort of conventional things that a film festival might have, film reels and, the sort of
very stereotypical
things that might be associated with film. And one of the things Donald was very interested in because of some of the other work I had done with them. And he's like, well, you have a really good sensibility with typography. We want a logo type.
Okay.
We wanted it very specific, with just the word iffy. We think that could be our brand. And then there was just a conversation that grew out of it. Well, what does this festival mean?
Yeah.
What are you trying to do? How do you separate yourself and distinguish yourself from other competitors?
Yeah.
Or not even competitors, other local festivals. I mean, the Ann Arbor Film Festival is a huge international film festival. It's just down the road from us here.
Right. And for people listening, right, there's Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. You could say we're sort of sister cities, but Ypsilanti is like, we are our own identity,
exactly.
Right? So we like to appreciate what goes on in Ann Arbor, but we also want to have our own thing. So I'm sure they wanted to say, like, we're something different.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of those things, they wanted something that was a little bit off, a little bit, basically embracing the word iffy. Something offbeat, something off kilter. And so I dug into what is the definition of iffy?
Yeah.
What are all the words that you could associate with iffy?
Yeah.
And then started trying to figure out how can I bring some of those qualities into the letter forms that became iffy. And so that early exploration goes into a lot of that. What's the right character? Like, what's the warping? What's the, how does it? I think one of the images I sent you earlier actually had a typeface that was a variable typeface that like you could change and wiggle. And so like it actually could be animated if we wanted to. And so there's a whole series of kind of proposed ideas. And I think whether I'm jumping from paper sketches to digital sketches or all of the in between, and I do a lot of just digital sketching.
And do you use a specific program for that?
Most of that was done in Adobe Illustrator.
Okay. So folks can have access to that. It's easy enough to get. I think they have a professional version, and do they still make a student version that has fewer bells and whistles?
Essentially the professional version.
Okay. They're just making it more affordable.
Ish. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, more affordable than the professional version, definitely. Yeah.
So they might say identity, but I think these days people refer to vibe, like what's the vibe of the thing? And so I can see as you're talking that it sounds to me like they wanted a vibe that was like independent, which is the name independent, right? So not only independent film, but independent Ypsilanti, but then also like iffy as in like maybe edgy.
Right.
Right? Like anything's possible over here. Like, iffy. Yeah, why not? So we're looking at an image on the screen now. There's 5 different iterations, and one of these, right, if we were doing a matching game, I could say to kids which one was the official logo, right? And I believe it's number 2.
Number 2 on the screen is the one. I think there might have been some small additional refinements I can't remember from here, but number 2 is what ended up being.
But when we get, so I'm as an art educator, right, we work with students, we're like, no, you need to try this multiple times. Like, no, I like the one, right? So like this would be a great example because it's virtually the brand that got selected. Only there's 5 different tweaks, let's call them. Like, and I can see you're tweaking with that top F mostly, right?
Correct.
Like, what were you thinking as you were making these tweaks?
So a lot of that was like, how do I want to play with, so that big kind of end terminal on the F is called the ball terminal.
That's the very top part that has like
that little ball on the end, and same with the Y.
Kind of looks like an apostrophe in reverse.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I was playing around, not all Fs have a ball terminal either, but I was playing around with that idea of like this ball terminal. Like, what could it be? What were the characters? How thin? Like, if you look at the number 5 one, like how thin and how much contrast do I want to give from the verticals to like the horizontal forms?
Yeah.
And really kind of just diving into sort of stylistic things. One of the elements and aspects to it is it has these serifs that actually cut into the font. And so there's a lot of font thinking that is also just like, if you're not a designer, you might not notice these things, but it's like, well, as a designer, how do I make something feel off? And so it has the back slant. And so instead of like a normal italic, which sort of leans right,
it
kind
going
of
to the
has a
left instead of to the
backslant, which
right.
actually has there's a whole history of backslant letters.
Yeah.
And so in a way it was kind of like, well, we're going to go to the right because we're not used to that. So that's one way to kind of bring about that like concept of slightly off. And then it was like, well, these serifs are going to behave in ways that they don't normally behave. And so they're going to cut into the letter instead of branching out of the letter. So if we think of a serif as the little thing on the bottom of a letter, like the foot of a letter.
I took one design class and it was like, all I do is sans serif and serif.
Right.
And I know that, for example, people who are dyslexic, it's easier for them to read sans serif rather than serif letters.
Yes.
But anyway, that's about as far as I go with it. And I'm sure people who are really proud of the fact that they learned the alphabet. So the letters you're talking with are like in the English language, right? You're using A through Z.
The Latin alphabet. Yeah.
The Latin alphabet. So most folks are learning their letters. They don't always know that every little part of the letter has a different name, right? Like there's pieces and parts to what we call these letters, which is maybe too detailed for what we'll talk about now, but it might come up. Yeah. So did you present these 5 and they picked one, or did you pick? You're like, nope, 2's one I'm going with. I'm not going to give them control over that.
So it's a conversation. There's actually probably multiple steps. There was a presentation of lots of ideas at one point in time. Like these are the directions, kind of what you see on screen now. So those were.
So if you're listening, right, there's like a mock-up T-shirt of this guy, no women, by the way, but the guy, who's wearing 5 different versions. One is the one that got selected, but then there's 4 others that are like not nearly as good. No, I mean, they're just way different, right?
Yeah. So what I presented was probably a little bit more involved than this, where I showed like the various logos in addition to being on T-shirts, also in context, like what might this look like on a web page? What might this look like in another, like, can we make stickers with this? That sort of thing. And that was sort of the first round of cuts. And there was also my telling the client, like, these are the ideas that I think are the ones worth pursuing. And then that conversation led to, can we see these other 2 get a little bit more developed? And so there was 2 ideas that got developed a little bit further, one being the one that ultimately we went with. And so then that second series that you saw with like the 5 is part of that design development stage. Like, I'm going to take this idea, run with it. What else can I do? How can I modify this? What tweaks can I make? And then even when I went back to them, I was like, here's my preference. And here's the reasons why.
Yeah.
I think they're doing some really interesting things. I feel like the 2 Fs almost look like they're like figures and kind of smiling. So it's almost like a little bit of like personality or quirkiness to it.
It does sort of have a sense of humor about it. I
and
like
so,
that you say that.
There's some of that, and those, like, that became part of the conversation as to like why I like this one over this one. And
so when we talk to artists, right, and we talk about the relationship between the viewer, right, and some people are like, oh, I don't ever consider the viewer, but in design, like, that's the whole game, right? Is the viewer. Like, you're not only doing what you want to do, but you have to work to please the person who's paying you.
Exactly. And
what is that like? Like, have you ever designed something for someone and like they're making you go in a direction that you really don't want to go in and you don't like what you've created, or do you bail out at that point, right?
Yes. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, okay.
I would say that I am a little bit wiser now to recognize that moment.
Maybe a little more secure financially as
well. A
well.
little bit more secure financially, or even before there was just like that desire to just carry through the project and tough it out. Or like you get to the stage where you realize like, okay, this is not the direction I wanted to go. Yeah. And I just don't put it in my portfolio. It exists out in the world.
Don't claim it.
I'll still
I made it. I'm not claiming it.
But it's one of those things that I just, find that at some point in time, you have to recognize that The end product is really a conversation often. So yes, I'm the creative director. I'm pushing it in one direction.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm working when collaborating with other people
Yeah.
as part of a bigger team. So I have worked with students that have helped me, and then we kind of work together. Like, here's my vision. You make this happen, and then we'll talk, and then we'll present it to the client, and kind of move on. And so
When you do that, do they get a cut of, like, if there's payment, do they just get credit, or do they get some of the financial reward from that as well?
I think the couple times I've done it, it's been either financial reward through grant funding,
I see.
or they were basically an intern for the organization, and I was doing the main design and lead design, and so I can't remember if they were getting paid by the organization.
So unlike artwork where you might buy the object, here in design you're often paid for the service. Right. So you might work for a number of things, and it includes all of these conversations. It includes the consultations, the final licensing rights, I guess, to the image.
Correct.
But in an artwork, you just here's the one-off. You like my painting? There you go.
Yeah. There's like usually a transfer of rights, basically. Like, I'm handing this thing over to you.
Yes.
You have full rights to do whatever you want with it, or in some cases, you can actually limit the rights. You try to work with the contract as much as possible.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's an email. In other cases, it's a full contract that says this is going to be the transfer of rights. This is what I'm giving you in the end product.
Yeah.
And if we want other things, let's talk and negotiate beyond that.
Interesting. Yeah. So I want to look at the spaces where you work, and then, but I want to notice for listeners too that there's sort of a separation. So this first project is a client based. And surely they're giving you passes to all the future, right? Maybe not to the festival. Hopefully they're doing that.
Yes.
That's great. So where you work, but then we'll shift too, and we talk about how you work, because some of the work you're doing in letterpress, I think, aligns more. So it's definitely design, but I think it aligns more with what we think of traditional notice interests of the artist, because I think it's more personal. Right? Like, you're doing it for you.
Correct.
More than doing it for a client.
Right.
So the space, the reason I mention that now is because the spaces we're looking at are combined. So you're doing this work for clients in these studios, but then you're also doing a letterpress. There's a letterpress studio we'll look at. So the image on the screen right now is a basement studio, right? So tell us about your organization here.
If there is an organization, I guess there's an organization.
You are an organized person. Everything is tucked away. I don't see a pile that looks random anywhere.
Yeah, the piles are not random, but there's lots of piles.
Yes.
What we're looking at is my basement, and what I have in there, and I'm going to actually have to look at the screen. There's a risograph printer that I use occasionally for doing risoprints.
What is that?
It's a type of printer that, if you think of, it's the combination almost of like a screen print with like offset printing and photocopy technology all into one.
Okay.
So it's a high volume duplicator. As an educator, you're probably familiar with a mimeograph.
Yeah, so the people who've been teaching for a while, we used to use those, and we used to sniff them after they were done because they had this amazing smell. Yes.
So it's basically the same technology as a mimeograph.
Okay.
It prints like single color inks at a time.
Okay.
And it creates a stencil around a drum, and that drum kind of paper gets shot out underneath it, and it's a high volume duplicator. And so I have that. I have a small press that I use to kind of do proofing of the type that I make. I don't do a lot of printing in my basement just because I don't want to use a lot of chemicals at home.
It's not safe.
Yeah. And there's not a lot of ventilation in my basement. And then in the back of the studio, you'll see my version of a standing desk, which is really tall.
Because you're tall.
Because I'm tall.
Yeah.
And also a CNC router.
What is that? What CNC?
Computer numeric controlled router.
Thanks.
And so that's how I do most of the cutting of the type that I create.
And so people who use tools all the time know what a router is, right? But it basically, I think of a router as like a drill that you can just move anywhere you want to. And it's like a free-form sewing machine. Anybody that sews, right, you can put that attachment onto your sewing machine that just lets you move the needle wherever you want. Would that be accurate?
A great description. It's a drill that you can move everywhere you want. And in this case, it's attached to a computer controlled device that moves it based on
So you don't even have to
the
move it by
software.
hand.
Nope.
You program it to move where you want it
Correct.
to go.
Yes.
And they can do that with sewing machines too, which
Yeah.
is fascinating to me. Yeah. And this image of your studio, I love the fact you've got tucked away at the bottom a little dog bed.
Yes.
What's your dog's name?
My dog is Maddie.
Maddie. Yeah. Okay. It's always important to have a nice dog in your studio. Yeah.
The funny thing is she doesn't really lay on her pillow. There's like what's next to the studio is like a small like workout space, and she goes and lays on the yoga mat,
Oh.
which is
So see, she's got a little bit of zen going on
Yeah.
there. Yeah. And so this studio we're looking at in the next image is on campus, and y'all call this the letterpress studio. So
Correct.
what does that mean? What is a letterpress, and why do you need a whole big studio for it?
So letterpress is a form of printing technology that dates back basically, well, it
Like
depends on
1440 maybe?
I think Gutenberg invented it in the 1500s. Well, is claimed to have invented it in the 1500s. It was actually invented even before then in China.
Right, like
the
around the
idea-
turn, like right at, I read something like maybe
I think it's
150
like
AD, something like that.
There's like various like date ranges, but I want to say the first pieces of movable type. So the actual blocks of letters that you can move
that you can,
around
yes.
and then typeset and rearrange to then do more. I want to say that's in the 1300s is when we have like our first evidence of it.
Yeah.
I could be wrong and might need to go back to my design history notes.
Well,
but-
and for listeners, the letterpress, I tell my students, like the letterpress is why we can read. And it's also why like the Catholics and the Protestants sort of split, because then people could start reading biblical text for themselves because they mass produced these documents instead of having to have clerics read them. And you just had to trust that these were sacred texts. Instead, you could look at it yourself. And so the fact that we're literate at all is due to this kind of
Yeah.
equipment. So
Yeah.
it has a long history.
It basically, I mean, it took years to actually get to the people at some point in time.
Sure.
But the idea that we can mass produce printed material was one of the like most revolutionary.
And then the Xerox machine
Things.
then changed it a whole other way. Like I can
Correct.
remember, I'm old enough, I hate to admit it, but I'm old enough I can remember when we didn't really have color. And then there were big machines that you could print something in color, and like it was super expensive and very rare. But the fact that now color is like, I don't know, people can easily print in colors. It's expensive in that your cartridges run out super fast.
Right.
So you don't have the longevity that you have in the black and white. But anyway, I digress. So tell us about your studio. So, right, we're in the letterpress studio. What goes on in this space?
So this is the print side of the room. There's actually two rooms at the Eastern studio. One is more for typesetting.
Yeah.
So that's like where we have like the cabinets that hold, the
Yeah.
type that you ultimately kind of put into a little form and then put onto the press. And then this is the press side of it, in which you'll see in the picture a handful of presses ranging from, I think, the early 1900s, maybe even late 1800s in the back corner.
Yeah.
All the way to some more contemporary presses, I think from about the 50s is where they're dated, maybe 60s. And you have some that self-ink, some that you have to hand bray. So braying is basically putting the ink onto the block that you're printing.
The brayer, we use that in relief printmaking, right?
exactly.
So if you're printing from a linoleum block, or if you're printing from even mono printing, you might use a brayer to coat the surface. So you do the same thing.
Letterpress is essentially a relief process. It's just raised little blocks of letter forms on type.
And it's typically in wood, but sometimes in rubber. I think I have a set
So
that's
actually,
rubber,
the Gutenberg and
those were metal.
Those were lead alloy, and it's still produced in lead alloy even today. So there's two kind of common types. There's actually a lot of different forms of letterpress. The most common of actual, like the blocks themselves, are either going to be a lead alloy. So we call
that
that
dangerous? I mean,
metal
it's
type.
lead, right?
It's not dangerous from the standpoint of like handling it. You're not going to get lead poisoning.
Okay.
Years and years of it. It's an alloy, so it's not
Right.
dangerous in that sense. If the lead does oxidize, you don't want to handle the oxidization, because that could be toxic, but it's not going to necessarily kill you. And then just, the you don't lick your fingers after using metal type and those kinds of things.
That's why it's important not to eat in a studio,
Exactly.
right? People will just sort of brush their
Yeah.
hands on their pants and then pick something up and
Right.
put it in your mouth. And if you do that, you're contaminating. And that's so important for art students
Yeah.
to know. Like, you just have to be really cautious about what you eat and drink
Yeah.
in a studio.
So there's metal type and then there's wood type.
Okay.
Those are the two most common ones. There's also other kinds of forms of making images that we transfer to a plate, like,
Yeah.
you know, it's basically like any kind of relief printmaking where you're making a plate, and, you know, there's all sorts of, like, you can make magnesium plates, polymer plates that you just stick on a block that you print. But the actual letterpress themselves, the blocks, the letter forms are typically either metal or wood.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you use these, I call them old processes, because now if we want letters on our designs, we can just pick a font in a digital program and lay it on there.
Mm-hmm.
But I know when I was in high school, between high school and college, I worked for a t-shirt company, and I used to cut transfers. And so, like, we had a film, and I'd use an X-Acto knife, and you had to basically cut away. It's like making a stencil. And we would attach it to the screen, except then once we got the design ready to go, we would send it to a typesetter who would then put the words on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all done through these processes. But now, since at least the 1990s, it's been pretty easy to just do it digitally. Well, not as easy as it is now, let's just say.
Yes.
And so now we're looking at an image of the wood shop.
Mhm.
And so why do you work in the wood shop?
So I make and fabricate wood type in particular.
So when you say wood type, you're making like sets of the alphabet.
Correct. Sets of the alphabet, wooden, like blocks of wood that are fabricated to a very specific height, which is the height that the press requires. They call it type high. And that involves a range of, I make and fabricate something called end grain blocks. And if we think about a straw, for example,
Okay,
or a bunch of
like
straws
that you drink out of, not that you feed a horse.
Yeah, if
Yeah.
you think about a bunch of straws on their side, like structurally, they're not like very strong.
Right.
And so end grain maple was used historically because it's super strong, like when
Yeah.
you have the straws kind of upright. And so you fabricate it so that the grain would be upright. For bigger type, they would make side grain, but I fabricate in very much the traditional method of trying to make end grain maple blocks.
Yeah.
Partly because a lot of my interest in experimentation at times is like, how far can I push this medium
Yeah.
with the technology we have today? And so it's kind of like looking at like the past and the present, like how can we inform the past and try to bring some of that heritage
Yeah.
back into the present with the technology we have today, and like what's that conversation between the two?
And using the end grain is going to be important because you want to be able to print it multiple times.
Correct.
And for those who don't work in wood, a good analogy or an association, if you've ever bought a 2-liter bottle of pop, if you try to press from the top of that 2-liter, it is super, super strong. But if you lay it on its side, it's really flimsy. Like you can push down in the middle and it's like it gives immediately.
Well, that's better than my straw analogy.
I did. Yeah, it's yours. You can have it.
That's great.
But I did a project where I was working with plastics with children, and I realized, oh my gosh, to get through the bottom of a 2-liter bottle, I had to bring in a drill, and I actually drill with a drill bit to get a hole in that. Where on the side, I could just poke it with a nail and just like punch it through. It was no big deal. So, So there you go. So you're designing different types of letters, really. So we've got an image on the screen now. It says branch is a Capricorn, and it has different phrases and words. And you called this, tell me what you call it. You put it in a folder and you called this a specimen? Is that
a specimen? A type specimen. Yeah.
So a specimen is like, here's ways you can use the type.
Exactly.
Fancy word for it. Okay.
Yeah. If we think about typeface, the design is actually the typeface itself, the font, and not necessarily the end use. I could suggest what the end use might be, but ultimately I'm making the object that ideally somebody else will use beyond me. And
so a potter's going to make a cup and a bowl, and you're going to use them how you will.
Right.
I might use it to eat out of, or I might use it to stamp something and do something, whatever. So you're saying, all right, here's this shape that we do call a letter. And you can put them in any combination you want, but here's what it looks like in a few that I've given you.
Correct.
That's the specimen.
Yeah, and it's also to show like the different weights, the different styles.
Yeah.
And so a specimen is basically a way of like showcasing. So on this screen right now, you'll see like there's a heavyweight, there's a regular weight, there's the italic version, there's the italic in caps and lowercase.
Is Branch a Capricorn or are you a Capricorn?
I am neither.
Okay.
It's Banch.
Banch, thanks.
Banch.
I don't know why I'm inserting an R in there. It's Banch.
Yeah.
That's the name of the style.
It's the name of the font. Yeah. Typeface. Yeah.
Did this exist or did you make it and did you give it this name?
I gave it this name. It's all original. The typeface in particular comes out of a question of how small can I make a typeface that's based on the router bit? And so you'll notice that interior corners, there are no interior corners that are hard and pointed. And so the idea is actually, again, it's a conversation about tools.
Yeah.
And a question of, if I wanted to make a typeface fast, I'm going to make it small.
Yes.
And if I wanted to make it small, I don't want to have to do any additional tool changes.
Because you're going to have to get in there and like chip out to make the right angle, 45-degree angle.
Yeah, so either chip it out or they make a special bit called a V-bit that kind of lifts up in the corner. But that requires you to change out tools and swap them out. And so there is this kind of question of what is the smallest I can make something with a bit? And then how does that then dictate what those letter forms look like?
So this is you not only thinking like an artist and wanting to design funky letters, but you're also a designer in like you gave yourself a problem.
Exactly.
Right? You wouldn't have had to give yourself that problem, but you're like, I want to make the easiest one I can that still looks cool.
Right.
Okay. I like that. So we see the whole alphabet. So basically you've designed all the letters. So when you're designing, obviously you do uppercase and lowercase numbers, and you've got the punctuation. What's with the hands and all those symbols? Are those just ones you?
So some of them are
standard?
additional. So some of them are just standard symbols. So you have like the you actually have daggers and double daggers on the bottom. You have some stars. You have manicules. Those are what the hands are. That's actually a very traditional like typographic thing.
Okay.
So if you look back at like Western posters or like old playbill posters from like the early 1900s, 1800s, you'll see like little hands pointing at dates and
which we might use arrows now,
right?
But they're like literally gesturing, like look at this.
Yeah, and so there's arrows too, and so some of that's what we call typographic ornament. The pilcrow, which is the paragraph sign, I believe that's its formal name, is the pilcrow. We see as like an actual symbol that dictates the beginning of a paragraph.
Yeah.
And so
that's why like 2 lines and a swoosh. Right?
Yeah.
Which one of those is that?
It's the one that kind of looks like a backwards P at the bottom.
Oh, it looks like a Grim Reaper thing. Yeah. So it's a new paragraph. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. It has that gothic. And so then you've got this So we just saw the printed. So that's
the digital version of the regular weight.
Okay.
Yep.
And so then now on screen we're looking at the image you have is a print of the blocks that are underneath.
Yeah. So the image that we're looking at right now is the actual fabricated version, I think, of the italic font in its heaviest weight, which we call black weight, and it's a carbon copy proof, so that you're not actually inking it up. It's just putting pressure.
You're just putting like graphite dust on there?
Yeah, it's like graphite paper that transfers onto. It's like the graphite transfer paper that people use for drawing.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And I wondered why it was lighter that way. I thought, well, is that just not a poor quality print, but right, usually you want print to be darker than that, but yet it's all pretty even. So I was like, well, actually it's a good quality, but so it's a graphite print.
Yeah.
So that would be great for people in schools. So if you're designing something and you're like, oh, I just don't have we don't have the ventilation, we don't have the wherewithal to really print this, but we want to test it and see what it looks like, then they could be using sheets of this graphite paper.
Yeah, it's actually a great, like, I use it mostly, particularly when I'm making and fabricating some kind of wood type for somebody that is ultimately going to use it. I want to keep the type what they call virgin, which has never been printed on.
Sure.
And so it's a good way to test to make sure that like every character is printing correctly.
Yeah. But you don't want to muck up the surface.
But you don't want to muck up the surface because you're ultimately going to give it to somebody or sell it or kind of
Nice.
let them be the ones who end up mucking
Right,
it
have
up.
the first opportunity to
Yeah.
print that thing. Yeah.
And
How do
so-
you clean a wood block? How do you get it clean?
So the surface, you can often, the surface is prepped with a really fine, you sand the surface of the block down to almost a like super fine finish
Yeah.
using shellac. That's the sort of traditional method. And when you use shellac, you have to just remember that you can't use sort of any alcohol-based cleaners to clean the type. So that leaves a couple options. In most cases, you can do what they call just dry wiping the type. So depending on the ink you print with, you should be able to like just
like an iron skillet. You're not going to put soap and water in that thing. You're just going to wipe it off
and
really
it's
good.
wood. And if you notice, only the top surface of the printing surface is sealed. The rest of the wood is unsealed. So you're not going to use water to clean it because then you're going to damage the wood itself.
I see.
And so you either use mineral spirits, so some kind of solvent, depends on the type of ink you're using, or
use oil-based
in some
inks
case-
or water.
At school, I use oil-based inks. And
Yeah.
we used oil-based inks at school. There's a lot of reasons we could go into talking about it
Yeah.
as to what the benefit is.
It's challenging because you want to talk about it in general, but there's some
Yeah.
definitely. So I don't want to get bogged down in this because I want to talk about your other fonts as well. But what are we looking at here? This is digital, so
this is before I cut it on the CNC router. This is some of the prep work that has to happen. And so I'm taking my font that I produced in font production software and then putting it into...
Is this like CAD?
This is basically a type of CAD program. It's called VCarve.
CAD stands for
computer-aided design.
Yeah.
And so this is basically what this is helping me do is generate what we call a toolpath.
Okay.
And the toolpath is I'm putting in very specific dimensions.
This is where the router's going to go.
This is where the router's going to go. I'm telling it what size of bit it's going to be in the router, and then it's going to generate the path that the router is going to use.
If I were going to meticulously do this by hand, this is the path I would travel.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then you're like, thank heaven I'm not doing it by hand because that's a lot of little lines going back and forth and back and forth. That would be a lot of steps if you were measuring it in terms of steps. Yes.
Yeah.
And so this is an interesting image just by itself because I have no idea what I'm looking at. And so, I look at this. So I see the letter N, I see the letter A, and then I see a whole bunch of symbols that look like when you drop a pin on Google Maps and you've got that little shape.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there's a name for that shape.
I don't know the name of the
Okay,
shape,
good. I don't
but
either.
I
So-
always thought it was a pin.
Well, the pin has that shape. So I'm looking at a bunch of different pins. Like, what are we looking at?
So this was an early sketch of the idea before the final. And so we're actually looking at some of the preliminary process where I was trying to think about, so the portion on the left is me thinking about using that V bit. So a V-shaped bit, that's basically like a point. Like what happens if it dials into the surface and kind of moves up and down? So if we take advantage of that, like how can we carve in to actually make letter forms? So if you actually look at it, you'll see that those are actually like letter forms. They're backwards because when we print, they would read right.
Right.
And so it was a kind of a quick test, like again, thinking about speed of production. Like what's the fastest way I could carve into a letter form?
So these are almost also like entry points.
Yeah.
Like the little, so if we thought of them as tadpoles, let's say, like you've got the little skinny end and that's where it's entering.
Yep.
And then it's going to move in and make a big swoosh.
Actually, it's just moving down and over.
So then you're getting the breadth of the bit.
So you're getting the depth of the bit and the width of it. Yeah.
I got you.
And so that was
and why is that important to test that?
Just to see like what are the possibilities. So if you look on the screen on, I think the second row on the right, you'll see an M or an N as the letter next to it.
The beginning of one. Yeah.
And so it was kind of an idea of like, how can I carve out these forms with as little.
And so then you're testing this and then you're going back and fussing with the programming on the computer.
Yeah.
Because you're once again, now it's a computer. Why care if it's efficient?
Or
is that just something that you want to do?
I think for me, that's more about time. Like a CNC router doesn't save a lot of time in like font production. So this isn't one of many fonts that I've produced on a CNC router.
Yeah.
And it's a slow process just to have something carve a ton of little details.
Yeah, and you're like, I want to speed this thing up.
At some point, I became like, when you sit by a machine,
because you have to be there.
You kind of have to be there.
Yeah.
You can walk away for a second or two, but
But if there's a malfunction, you don't want it to like
You don't
totally
want it to,
destroy them.
like,
And these are
destroy
expensive
everything.
pieces of equipment.
Exactly. And so, you know, you start to wonder, like, how can I speed this process
I
up?
gotcha.
Like, what can I do to make this faster?
Yeah, and so folks who don't do this work might say, "Well, why are you talking about this? Who cares?" But I think it's important when you're designing, right? Like, and I always want students to understand that we can present challenges to ourselves at multiple stages of the process. So, like, there's the challenge of designing the font, but then there's the challenge of creating it in a way that's efficient and even economical sometimes. But those are challenges that engage the process that I
Right.
think are really thrilling. And so here's the virgin sample of the lowercase.
Mhm.
Now they're regular letters. What do you
So this
what do you
I
call
think is
regular
still
letters?
so this is just
Or is that
your
still the
regular.
italic?
Yeah, the italic. So italic is actually a type of style of like the letter form itself. It doesn't actually mean slanted. It's about how it's drawn. So the
I
easiest
did
way
not
to
know that, because on a computer, anytime you hit italicized, it just leans it to the
yeah.
right.
So there's actually a thing. It's kind of rare nowadays, but there's something called upright italics. And the
Okay.
easiest way to tell is just how an A is drawn,
Okay.
oftentimes. And it goes back to our days of calligraphy. And so an italic was just drawn in a slightly different way than your
Okay.
upright letter forms were. And so,
Well, I wonder if they're also making them more upright these days because we don't write by hand like we used to. And what's happening is children cannot read. They cannot read italicized writing. Like if
right.
when you write script
Yeah.
that's in italics, they can't read it.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh my gosh, one day all of us folks who are older are going to have like this secret language
Yeah.
that no one's going to be able to
Yeah.
read because they never were taught how to read it.
Yeah.
They had a big story on NPR about how grandchildren can't read the letters their grandparents are sending them because of
Oh,
the
the
writing.
cursive handwriting.
The
Yeah.
cursive, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think cursive and italicized, I think of the same, but they're not. You're saying it's a design issue.
Yeah, it's based on like almost all letter forms are based on a pen movement.
Okay.
And the whole history goes down to like the type of pen dictating,
Yeah.
like where thicks and thins on a letter form would exist, whether it's a broad nib pen, which has like a flat tip.
I learned one style of calligraphy when I was young, and don't ask me what it's called. I don't know, but yeah, like you pick the pen up to make the one stroke, and then you make a different stroke. Like it's a matter of how many strokes to make the letter, which I thought was interesting. Yeah. So we're going to shift. So now these are something that you called ornaments.
Correct.
So what's the difference between typeface and ornaments?
So
like I think of an ornament on a tree, right?
Right.
Like if you celebrate Christmas, you buy ornaments. So
we have a whole history of like the decorated page. And if we think like all the way back to like a lot of Renaissance books where you had huge decorations on the page, that was a type of ornament or ornamentation. And in printing, it carried through, even till today, that sort of idea of like, let's have something. It's called typographic ornament because it was produced in the same fashion as a printer's block would for the letter forms. So you would have either cast metal or carved wood that you would typeset along with your letter forms, and that would create borders, patterns, small little details.
Yeah, and so maybe that was a bridge between the type and an illustration.
Correct.
We're not going to go to all the trouble of the illustration, but we can jazz it up with some ornaments.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And these are two influences that have inspired you. I know you had several, but these were the two that I thought would look best on my slideshow.
No, that's great. So on the left, you have Alvin Lustig's kind of set of ornaments, and you could kind of see a crazy little pattern that he made with all these geometric ornaments.
Yeah.
Kind of very Frank Lloyd Wright-esque. Alvin Lustig was probably doing these in that era of like Art Deco period.
Bauhaus. And that kind of,
And then on the right, you have William Page. So this is like from the 1850s, different border styles. And so, we could think of like borders just being like, we see them all the time. You surround like a piece of text with a border.
Well, and those could be geometric borders. Like if you think back, I mean, people used to decorate with border wallpaper back in the 1980s, but they were like cheesy country things, but this is like really geometric. Like these could be super cool.
Yeah.
Or I could see these as the beginnings of like tribal tattoo, right?
Yeah.
They have sort of that
They do
look
have
about
that look.
them.
And I'm certain that a lot of them are influenced by different forms of architecture.
Yeah.
That whole history of.
So to me, then I see this relationship between art and design really come through in designing these ornaments.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm gonna you gave me this. This is like a 1 minute long animation. So basically, you had one where you proposed these as letters, but then I counted. There's more than 26 here, right? So I'm like, how? So I know you kind of see them as letters, but are they?
So in a digital space, technically, like I would type A
Yeah.
to get one of these characters. And
I see.
so it's really, they're letters only in the sense that our keyboard doesn't have weird symbols on them.
Oh,
And
so you don't really intend them to be letters.
No.
You're just, that's the shortcut to
that's
get
the
them.
shortcut to get them.
Okay. And so if I press this, it'll play an animation then. And so what we'll see is they're changing. Now, why create this?
So variable font technology is something that allows the user, the end user, to kind of like make different variations of that form. And so it actually expands like the opportunities that you could have of, so I might have 26 characters up there.
Yeah.
But then like you start playing with the slider and there's almost.
And this is what digital technology affords us.
Right.
Because then quite frankly, how many minutes? So, it's playing for a minute, but you're doing the same gesture multiple times. So technically, however many seconds or whatever is how many iterations you have of that one character.
Yeah. And I think like the slider range is like 1 to 1,000. So technically there would be like,
oh my gosh,
999 subtle variations that you could potentially have of that letter form. And my interest in this was how could I take variable font technology? Isn't that new? It's been around for a while, but it's actually becoming more commonplace now. And so my interest was how can I take this technology and then apply it to something that I'm then going to produce in wood where it becomes fixed. And like, what's that kind of conversation between
the difference between video and a still?
Yeah. And so at some point it's taking this and using it to then fabricate different variations of a single ornament or multiple ornaments. And then, what can I do to print with that?
So here's images we have, and maybe this was related to your printing the wood type, but you're going to do the same process in making these ornaments, right? So for those of you listening, Ryan's on the left and he's, all equipped and he's working in the wood shop and he's really like using a table saw to really break down larger pieces of wood into these blocks. And then you can see on the right-hand side, there's a stack of these blocks next to a sander.
Yep.
And then...
Yeah. So this is just me in the process of fabricating the end grain maple blocks. So on the left, you have me at the jointer squaring up at least one side of it, so that when I do take it to the table saw, I can make sure that they're all in line. And then on the right, it's definitely a drum sander, and that's just a way of mass producing and getting that like super smooth printing surface, or it's the first kind of step. And so it'll actually make multiple passes through a drum sander.
Are you using maple because it's cheap?
I'm using maple because it's strength. So hard rock, what they call it, hard rock maple or just hard maple, is one of the stronger woods that we have in North America.
Really?
And it's also really dense.
Yeah.
So if we think of like oak has a lot of like porousness to it.
Yeah.
And that's not going to leave you a really nice surface to print with necessarily, like a smooth, clean printing surface. And so you do have things, you can make it out of beech. Maple's a little stronger, like hard maple's a little stronger. And I think like in the UK, it's like woods like pear and hornbeam. I think English hornbeam is another.
I have an English
one.
hornbeam in my backyard.
And so those are like, it's really regional. So we had a lot of birch trees in the north, northern part of the US. And most of the wood type was like fabricated in like New York.
Okay.
So
here on the screen, we're looking at, I guess, let me guess. Okay, so it's not only the design, but this is also the router maps for the ornaments.
Yeah, so this is on the software
can
side.
be taught.
Yes. So this is actually the software that's now talking directly to the router, and it's just like showing. So the toolpath has been created, and now I'm using.
And this is in process as it's carving,
It's
so
in
you can
process as
watch.
it's covering. Yeah.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah. So you can see where the toolpath is, and then there's the image of without the dust collection on, because I think that particular video I had to turn on. I wanted to see what you're doing.
Yeah, and if you have that dust collector on, it makes so much noise you can't think, right?
It's also you just can't see the bit doing its thing because there's
does it
like
cover
a
the whole
sleeve.
process?
Yeah.
Oh, the whole mechanism's
Yeah.
covered.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
That way you don't have dust everywhere.
And this is screwed down to help keep it from the wood block from moving. And
Yep.
are these individual blocks, or is it all one block and then you cut them apart?
So that would be multiple blocks. So it's all one big. I cut them out of like one single block, and that would
Yeah.
ultimately be about let's see, 16 different wood type.
But they're not
ornaments.
separate when you do this initial carving, because they would all jumble around and
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
You wouldn't have the same accuracy. So
Right.
you carve it as one mass,
Mhm.
get it where it needs to be, and then it gets cut apart into the individual
Yeah. And
movable
sometimes I'll
blocks.
use the machine to do that. And sometimes I have what's called a type saw, which
Yeah.
is like a very specific table saw for cutting type.
I think you should make things like this for kids, right? Like, I mean, it's not unlike
Yeah.
the blocks they play with. And so if you could put these designs on a couple blocks, and then we could, they could use non-toxic,
Mhm.
like I have
Stamping,
I
yeah.
am now a great aunt.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And so I'm thinking about my great niece and like, oh my gosh, like to be able to stamp with these kinds
Yeah.
of characters would be lovely instead of just the ones you get from the store. you
I
know?
actually sent a set of ornaments recently to somebody in Florida that their intention is to actually work with high school kids, like middle school kids,
Yeah.
and teach them letterpress. But they're going to just use like abstract ornamental forms to like make whatever they want.
Well, and I was intrigued when you had them connected to the letters, because I thought if if you had a set of these 26 abstract shapes, it can then make secret code.
You could.
That would be
Like,
so
that
fun.
would-
Like I remember being a kid and loving to do that. Like, right. And what kid doesn't sit around and design fonts and letters? And
Right.
as an art teacher, they were always asking me, of course, kids called them bubble letters. Like, I want to make bubble letters. I'm like, no, you don't. You can't read bubble letters. And then I would
Yep.
show them all other fonts, and they were like, and that's before we had
Yeah.
computers, and they were like fascinated to learn different
There's-
ways and styles to make letters.
There's a famous article that was done and published in a Ray Gun magazine by David Carson, where he used wingdings.
Okay.
And so if you actually sat there and decoded
Wingdings.
how wingdings mapped to the keyboard,
yeah.
you could then read the article.
But you have to really be committed. Yeah.
yeah.
So here's just I love this image you've taken of just the collection. And I think this is a piece you called, what was it called? All Matter.
Oh, so this was part of a print swap collection, All Types Matter.
All Types
It was
Matter.
focused on kind of diversity, issues around diversity, celebrating diversity. And so in a way, like I find this is more of where like designer and artists kind of are all at the same kind of intersection. And so, yeah, I made the font, and now this is me applying the font in a way that I think could be interesting. And so I used the software to make 300 different variations of the different ornaments
Wow.
in the set.
And that's what we're looking at here in the final
And you're looking
image.
at that. And then if
So this
you-
might have been one printing, and then you had because some of them are printed over with more than one color.
correct.
So you would have
Yeah.
had to run that through your press. So
So
how many
that
times did
actually-
you run it through the press?
It went through the press technically 7 times. So
Okay.
the actual, you could see it on the left that I only had enough. The 300 ornaments only covers like half of it. And so
Yeah.
I would do like one half, print that, move them all over, rearrange them, one half. And so the whole idea is that like if I just randomly place all of these,
Yeah.
each final ornament, when you get all 3 colors on top, are all going to be unique.
Okay.
And so that there's not going to be a single one that repeats within the whole entire set, as a way of also kind of celebrating the idea of diversity.
Nice.
And then there's just a nice little kind of statement about my belief in like that part of what makes diversity like work is that we have to just listen to each other, and that's to help better understand everybody. And so it was kind of like, let's show like the world as diverse as it is,
Yeah.
with like a very small statement.
Well, and I love that
underneath
you're
it.
taking a set of basic shapes and
Mhm.
saying, yeah, but look at how many combinations there
Yeah.
are. So even if we make assumptions about the commonality of a few simple things, to realize like we are far more complex
Right.
as human beings.
Yeah.
And this is a good way to show that graphically.
Yeah.
Oh, that's lovely,
Yeah.
Ryan. I love that. And then just to animate, do you call this an animation? Or so you've taken a couple of these
Yeah.
symbols, and what you're seeing on the screen is images that just start to move. I'll play it here again one more time. So, right, we're just looking at kind of like a windmill of different. I think it's called a windmill pattern in quilting.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're changing the colors, blue and yellow, and we see it transition. Why does this matter?
So this is just me testing the font, the
Yeah.
digital like version of the ornaments, and also kind of exploring like what are some of the possibilities of it. So I made this thing, and I just,
Let's see what it does.
let's see what it does. And like again, it's kind of also serving as a specimen to a degree. Like this
Yeah.
is one use that I see
Yeah.
potentially happening. And so in a way, it's just me kind of exploring this. What I didn't show you is I have a whole folder of just me making random patterns.
Yeah.
Before I ever kind of output anything digital, like to the physical world as well. So
Interesting. So interesting. So yeah, we're kind of at our close here. So it's been great talking to you, Ryan, and I really appreciate the fact that you're not only committed to your craft, but also thinking about how you constantly are giving yourselves design challenges within the challenges. So even the fact that you designed these ornaments, you don't have to make an animation of it, but you're like, oh, I want to see what it would look like. So I think that's a good model for students that are thinking about being designers, is how can you constantly be putting these problems out in front of yourselves?
yeah.
Well, I want to end with some advice that we would give listeners in thinking about design. And so I'd like you to think about that for a minute. And let me thank a few people. I just want to say, first of all, that this series is made possible by the EMU College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Faculty Professional Development Award, which was made possible through a generous gift from the Game Above. This is a group of dedicated Eastern Michigan University alumni with various academic and professional backgrounds. I would be remiss, right, if we didn't thank Max. Max, thanks for making this sound so good. Max is with Be Now Media and is the producer of this series. And special thanks to Grove Studios in Ypsilanti for giving us such a lovely space to make us sound good as we're doing this. And I really want to thank my artists and designer, particularly. So, Ryan, let's give you the last word. What advice, 5 tips, if you could give people in thinking about the design process?
So I'm gonna steal my 5 tips or borrow my 5 tips.
Borrow. We don't advocate stealing, but borrowing. Yeah.
From Sister Karita Kent. She was the director at the Immaculate Heart College. Kind of a fascinating story. Radical nun.
Radical nuns are always fascinating. Yes.
And she has a list of 10 rules that she would provide in her studio, and so I've picked like my 5 favorite
Okay.
for that. Rule number 2 was pull everything out of your teacher. Pull everything out of your fellow students.
Okay.
I really find that to be like, as a student, you should just
Pick their
absorb,
brain.
pick their brain, as much knowledge as you can from those people that are there. Rule number 4 is consider everything an experiment. I think we value things too precious often. And if we
Yeah.
think about them as just like an experiment, a way to kind of get an idea out,
Yeah.
we don't think of it as precious. And my work is often rooted just in that sort of mentality anyways. And big
Might be
fan of
more
that
willing
one.
to take some risk. If
Yeah,
you-
exactly.
Yeah.
Rule number 6, nothing is a mistake. So very much related to the other one. There is no win and no fail. There's only make. And I think, again, if we kind of think about ourselves as creative practitioners, it's really the making that's the part that's super engaging. And we're going to have failures. We're going to have other things, but like, it's that making. You're going to inform yourself somehow.
Yeah.
And learn from that. Rule number 8, don't try to create and analyze at the same time. They're different processes. I find as an educator, with students, oftentimes, and particularly like when we get into the digital space, you have a student who starts a design and will like just select all, delete it. And it's like, well, why did you do that? And they're like, oh, I didn't like it. It wasn't coming out as my vision. I was like, but you only had like 3 lines on the page, How do you know at this stage?
So they're analyzing too soon and not giving themselves the benefit of the doubt.
There's also there are like parts of our brains that work very differently, like the creation and the analysis. And, I do think it does take like time to get to where you can process those rapidly. But we also have to sometimes distance ourselves from things. And like if you're not creating that distance to where you can then look at it, I think it's a perfect statement. And then the last one is her rule number 9, which is be happy whenever you can manage. Enjoy yourself. It's lighter than you think.
That's a good way to end.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Rule 10 is that there should be new rules tomorrow.
Well, just don't get stuck in your brain, right? Like have an idea and just test it out, try it, and just get in there and do it. So,
But I find anytime somebody asks me for advice, like Sister Krita Kent's rules it's on my syllabus even. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. That's wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And this has been great. I appreciate your time.
Thanks,
and I appreciate knowing more about your process. And so thank you for that. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. And, may you go out into the world and engage creative design processes for yourselves. I'm Dr. Cam McComb, and this has been Engaging Process. Thanks again, Ryan. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cam.